December 8, 1941. The wardroom of the battleship Nagato, flagship of the combined fleet, anchored in Hiroshima Bay. Officers crowded around the wireless room, listening to reports filtering in from Vice Admiral Nagumo's strike force, now steaming eastward from Hawaiian waters. The news was extraordinary. 8 American battleships sunk or damaged, over 300 aircraft destroyed, nearly 2,500 Americans killed. A complete surprise achieved. The officers were jubilant. Some openly wept with joy, others embraced. Sake was broken out despite the early hour. The attack they had practiced for months in secret, the operation so audacious that many had doubted it could succeed, had exceeded their wildest expectations. America's Pacific Fleet lay in ruins at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, but in a corner of the wardroom, away from the celebration, sat Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, the man who had conceived and championed this attack. His face was drawn, his expression grim. While his officers celebrated the greatest naval victory in Japanese history, Yamamoto sat motionless, staring at the decoded messages spread before him. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. A junior officer, noticing the Admiral's mood, approached hesitantly. "Sir, should we not join the celebration? This is a great victory." Yamamoto looked up slowly. His eyes, colleagues would later recall, held no joy, only a deep, terrible sadness. He said nothing, simply returning his gaze to the reports. Why was the architect of this triumph so troubled? The answer would not become clear for days, even weeks, as Japan celebrated what appeared to be the death blow to American power in the Pacific. But Yamamoto knew something his celebrating officers did not. He understood what they had truly accomplished that morning, and it terrified him. The legend that would emerge from that day, popularized decades later by Hollywood, claimed that Yamamoto uttered a famous warning: "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." The quote is powerful, dramatic, perfect for cinema. There is only one problem. He almost certainly never said it. No diary entry contains it, no letter records it, no witness heard it. But the sentiment, the fear, the understanding of what Japan had just unleashed, that was absolutely real. What Yamamoto actually said and wrote in the days following Pearl Harbor was, in many ways, far more chilling than any Hollywood script could capture. To understand Yamamoto's reaction, we must first understand the man himself. He was, in every sense, a paradox. A Japanese admiral who had lived in America and grown to admire it. A brilliant naval strategist who opposed war with the United States. A patriot who had just executed an attack he believed would doom his nation. Isoroku Yamamoto was born in 1884 in Nagaoka, in Niigata Prefecture. His birth name was actually Isoroku Takano. The name Isoroku meant 56 in Japanese, a reference to his father's age when he was born. He would later be adopted by the Yamamoto family, taking their name. His early life was marked by the rapid transformation of Japan following the Meiji Restoration, the period when Japan raced to modernize and join the ranks of world powers. Yamamoto entered the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1901, just as Japan was preparing for war with Russia. He graduated in 1904, and in 1905, as a young ensign, he participated in the Battle of Tsushima, one of the most decisive naval victories in history. Japan's fleet under Admiral Togo had annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet. For young Japanese officers, Tsushima became the template for naval warfare. Achieve surprise, strike decisively, destroy the enemy fleet in one climactic battle. But Yamamoto was wounded at Tsushima. He lost 2 fingers on his left hand. The injury marked him physically for life, but more importantly, it gave him credibility. He had shed blood for the emperor. He had proven himself in combat. This credibility would be crucial later, when he advocated positions that contradicted prevailing military opinion. What truly set Yamamoto apart from his peers was his experience in the United States. From 1919 to 1921, he studied at Harvard University. He learned English fluently. He traveled extensively across America, from the east coast to the west, through the industrial heartland. He visited factories in Detroit, saw the oil fields of Texas, watched cargo being loaded at ports in San Francisco, and he understood something fundamental that most Japanese officers did not. America was not just wealthy, it was systematically, industrially, overwhelmingly powerful, in a way that fighting spirit could not overcome. When Yamamoto returned to Japan, he served in various capacities, eventually rising to become a vice admiral and deputy navy minister. In this role, during the 1930s, he fought against the growing military faction that wanted war with the United States. He argued, sometimes forcefully, that Japan could not win such a war. His position made him enemies. Extremist military officers saw him as weak, even traitorous. There were credible assassination threats against him. In 1940, as tensions between Japan and the United States escalated, Yamamoto had a meeting with Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoye. The Prime Minister asked him directly, if war came, could Japan win? Yamamoto's answer was brutally honest. If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second and third years. Think carefully about what he was saying. Japan's top naval commander, speaking to the Prime Minister, was stating explicitly that Japan could not win a prolonged war with America. The best he could promise was 6 months to a year of success. After that, defeat was inevitable. But Konoye and the military faction believed they could force a quick victory. The plan was simple. Strike a devastating blow to American naval power, seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia while America was reeling, then negotiate a peace from a position of strength. America, they believed, lacked the will to fight a long, costly war in the Pacific. Once confronted with the fait accompli of Japanese dominance in Asia, America would accept it. Yamamoto knew this was fantasy. He had lived in America. He understood American character in a way his colleagues did not. He knew that a surprise attack, particularly one that inflicted heavy casualties, would not break American will. It would unite it. But by early 1941, war was inevitable. The Japanese government was committed to its course. The question became, if war must come, how do we give Japan the best possible chance? It was in this context that Yamamoto conceived the Pearl Harbor attack. The plan was audacious, nearly impossible. Japan would send 6 aircraft carriers across 5,000 miles of ocean, maintaining absolute radio silence, to launch a surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet at its main base. If successful, it would cripple American naval power in the Pacific for months, perhaps over a year. The key word is if. The risks were enormous. American submarines might detect the fleet, reconnaissance aircraft might spot them. The carriers might be at sea when they attacked. Weather could prevent the attack. A dozen things could go wrong. But in April and May of 1941, the British had demonstrated that carrier-based torpedo bombers could successfully attack ships in harbour. At Taranto, Italy, British aircraft had completing dollarzi, severely damaged the Italian fleet. Yamamoto and his planners, particularly Commander Minoru Genda, studied Taranto intensively. If the British could do it with 1 carrier, Japan could do it with 6. Training began in earnest that spring. Pilots practiced on Kagoshima Bay, which resembled Pearl Harbor's layout. Torpedo pilots drilled constantly on low-altitude attacks. They developed special, shallow-running torpedoes that could work in Pearl Harbor's 40-foot depths. Horizontal bombers practiced precision strikes. Fighter pilots studied American aircraft types and tactics. The planning was meticulous. Every detail was examined. What time would achieve maximum surprise? What would be the composition of each attack wave? How would targets be prioritized? What weather conditions would provide the best chance of success? By October of 1941, the plan was ready. The Naval General Staff gave final approval. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was appointed to command the strike force. The Kido Butai, the 1st Air Fleet, would consist of 6 heavy carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. They would be escorted by 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines. On November 26, 1941, the strike force departed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands. They steamed eastward, maintaining absolute radio silence. The northern Pacific route they took was far from normal shipping lanes. The weather was terrible, grey skies, rough seas, perfect concealment. For 11 days, they crossed the Pacific undetected. On the morning of December 7th, they reached their launch position 230 miles north of Oahu. The first wave of 183 aircraft launched at 6 a.m. local time. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led them toward Pearl Harbor. The second wave of 171 aircraft followed shortly after. At 7:48 a.m., Fuchida transmitted the code, Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. Complete surprise had been achieved. For the next 2 hours, Japanese aircraft tore through American defenses. Torpedo bombers struck Battleship Row with devastating accuracy. Dive bombers hit aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip on airfields. Fighters strafed anything that moved. The battleship USS Arizona exploded when a bomb penetrated her forward magazine. Over 1,100 men died in seconds. The battleship Oklahoma capsized, trapping over 400 men inside. The battleship West Virginia settled to the bottom, her hull torn open by torpedoes. The Nevada tried to make a run for the harbor entrance, but was hit repeatedly and had to beach herself. By 10 a.m., it was over. 8 battleships had been sunk or damaged. 3 light cruisers and 3 destroyers were damaged. 188 aircraft destroyed. 2,403 Americans killed. 1,200 wounded. It was, from a tactical perspective, a devastating success. Back on Nagato, as reports came in throughout December 7th and 8th, Yamamoto's staff celebrated. They had pulled off the impossible. They had struck the Americans a blow that would take months, perhaps years, to recover from. Japan now had free rein in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The southern operation, the seizure of oil-rich territories, could proceed without interference from American naval power. But Yamamoto did not celebrate. Witnesses recorded that he spent the day after Pearl Harbor sunk in apparent depression. While every other officer in the combined fleet was jubilant, Yamamoto sat alone, reading and rereading the damage reports. Not what they had destroyed, but what they had not. The damage reports told a story that anyone else would have considered a complete triumph. But Yamamoto was reading between the lines, analyzing not just what Nagumo's strike force had accomplished, but what they had failed to accomplish. And the failures, he realized, were potentially catastrophic. The American aircraft carriers were not in port. Enterprise had been delivering marine aircraft to Wake Island. Lexington was ferrying planes to Midway. Saratoga was on the west coast undergoing maintenance. All 3 had escaped. The most valuable targets in the Pacific Fleet, the ships that represented the future of naval warfare, were intact and would soon be hunting Japanese ships. But there was something else, something that troubled Yamamoto even more than the missing carriers. He pulled out a reconnaissance photograph of Pearl Harbor, taken before the attack. His finger traced over a cluster of structures on the eastern side of the base. The fuel oil storage facilities. 45 massive tanks containing 4.5 million barrels of oil. Commander Genda entered the wardroom, still flushed with excitement from the day's success. He found Yamamoto staring at the photograph. Admiral, the men are asking if you will join them in a toast. Yamamoto did not look up. Genda, did any of our aircraft strike these targets? He pointed to the oil tanks. Genda leaned closer. No, sir. The first 2 waves focused on ships and aircraft as planned. The third wave would have targeted support facilities, but Vice Admiral Nagumo decided to withdraw. Yamamoto's expression darkened. And the repair facilities? The dry docks? The submarine base? Also untouched, sir. Admiral Nagumo felt we had achieved our objectives. He was concerned about American counterattack. The fleet withdrew to avoid. He withdrew. Yamamoto's voice was flat. We had complete surprise. We destroyed their battleships. We could have spent another 2 hours methodically destroying everything that makes Pearl Harbor useful as a naval base, and we withdrew. Genda shifted uncomfortably. Sir, the third wave would have faced much stronger anti-aircraft fire. The Americans were fully alert by then. Losses could have been acceptable. Yamamoto stood abruptly. Those losses would have been acceptable, Genda. Do you understand what we failed to do today? We sank their old battleships. Congratulations. But we left them 4.5 million barrels of fuel. We left them repair facilities that will allow them to salvage those battleships we think we destroyed. We left them a submarine base that will send American submarines throughout the Pacific to hunt our merchant fleet. We accomplished nothing strategic. Nothing. This conversation, reconstructed from various accounts by Yamamoto's staff officers, reveals the depth of his frustration. While Tokyo celebrated, Yamamoto was conducting a brutally honest analysis of the attack's limitations. The oil situation was particularly critical. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who would take command of the Pacific Fleet after Pearl Harbor, later stated, "Had the Japanese destroyed the oil, it would have prolonged the war another 2 years." The fuel stored at Pearl Harbor represented the entire operational capacity of the Pacific Fleet. Without it, American ships would have been forced to withdraw to the west coast, effectively conceding the Central Pacific to Japan. The repair facilities were equally important. The dry docks, machine shops, and trained personnel at Pearl Harbor represented capabilities that simply did not exist anywhere else in the Pacific. With these facilities intact, the Americans could begin salvage operations immediately. Ships that appeared destroyed could be raised, repaired, and returned to service. And that is exactly what happened. Of the 8 battleships hit at Pearl Harbor, only 2 Arizona and Oklahoma were complete losses. West Virginia was raised in May 1942 and returned to service in 1944. California was raised in March 1942 and returned in January 1944. Nevada was repaired and fought throughout the rest of the war. Tennessee and Maryland required only minor repairs. Pennsylvania had been in dry dock during the attack and sustained minimal damage. Within 6 months of the attack, 6 of the 8 battleships were back in action. This was possible only because the repair facilities at Pearl Harbor survived intact. Yamamoto understood this immediately. His staff did not. On December 9th, Yamamoto met with his senior officers to discuss next steps. The minutes of this meeting, captured after the war, reveal a commander trying desperately to make his subordinates understand the strategic situation. "We have won a great tactical victory," he told them. "But we must not confuse tactical success with strategic achievement. The American fleet is damaged, not destroyed. Their industrial capacity is untouched. Their will to fight has not been broken. In fact," he paused, looking around the room, "I fear we have done something very dangerous. We have unified them." This was Yamamoto's greatest fear, and it was being confirmed by intelligence reports, filtering in from neutral countries. American public opinion, which had been deeply divided about entering the war, had shifted overnight. Isolationism had vanished. The attack, particularly the fact that it occurred while Japan and America were technically still at peace, had enraged the American public. The timing was a disaster. Japanese diplomats in Washington had been instructed to deliver a declaration of war 30 minutes before the attack commenced, but delays in decoding and translating the lengthy message meant it was not delivered until after the attack had begun. From the American perspective, this was not an attack. It was a sneak attack, a stab in the back while diplomats were still negotiating. Yamamoto was furious about this failure. One officer recorded him saying, "A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame. Simply, for the one smitten. I would rather you made your appraisal after seeing what the enemy does, since it is certain that, angered and outraged, he will soon launch a determined counterattack." This quote, from a reply to journalist Ogata Taketora on January 9, 1942, captures Yamamoto's actual sentiment far better than the mythical sleeping giant quote. He was not prophesying doom in dramatic terms. He was conducting a sober analysis of cause and effect, Japan had attacked America while claiming to negotiate peace. America would respond with fury. That fury would be translated into industrial mobilization and military action. Japan had perhaps a year before that response became overwhelming. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The reports from America confirmed Yamamoto's fears. On December 8th, President Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress. His speech was brief, direct, and devastating in its simplicity. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The vote was nearly unanimous, only one dissenting vote in the House of Representatives. Public opinion polls conducted in the days after Pearl Harbor showed 97% support for the war declaration. Young men flooded recruitment offices. Factories began converting to war production. The American industrial machine, the very thing Yamamoto feared most, was waking up. And then, on December 11th, Adolf Hitler made a catastrophic error. Germany declared war on the United States. Hitler was not required to do so under the tripartite pact. That alliance called for mutual defense only if a member was attacked, not if a member initiated hostilities. But Hitler, convinced that Germany would defeat the Soviet Union before American industrial power could be brought to bear, declared war anyway. This meant that America, which might have focused exclusively on Japan, would now fight a two-front war. But it also meant that American industrial capacity would be fully mobilized. The Germany First strategy that American war planners adopted meant that the Pacific would be a secondary theater, but it would still receive resources that dwarfed anything Japan could produce. Yamamoto knew the numbers. He had studied them carefully. In 1941, American steel production was approximately 8 times that of Japan. American oil production was roughly 100 times greater. American shipbuilding capacity was perhaps 15 to 20 times larger. American aircraft production would soon exceed Japan's by a factor of 10 to 1. These were not abstract statistics to Yamamoto. They were the concrete reality that would determine the war's outcome. He tried to explain this to his staff, to the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, to anyone who would listen. Most did not want to hear it. They were intoxicated by victory, convinced that Japanese fighting spirit would overcome American material advantages. But there were others who understood. Admiral Chuichi Hara, who would fight throughout the war, later summarized the situation perfectly. "We won a great tactical victory at Pearl Harbor and thereby lost the war." In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, as Japan's armies swept across Southeast Asia, conquering the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Yamamoto was already planning for the inevitable American counteroffensive. He understood that Japan had perhaps 6 months of relatively free operations before American strength would begin to tell. He focused on a plan to draw out and destroy the American carriers, particularly Enterprise and Lexington, which had escaped Pearl Harbor. If he could sink those carriers, Japan might buy another 6 months. The plan would culminate in an operation to seize Midway Island, forcing the Americans to commit their carriers to a decisive battle. But even as he planned this operation, Yamamoto was under no illusions about Japan's long-term prospects. In private conversations with his staff officers, recorded in their diaries and memoirs, he repeatedly returned to the same themes. Time was against Japan. American industrial power was awakening. The window for Japanese operations was closing rapidly. One staff officer, Captain Yasuchi Watanabe, recorded a conversation from late December 1941. Yamamoto had been studying intelligence reports about American mobilization. Factories were converting to war production. Shipyards were expanding. Training camps were being established. The scale of the mobilization was staggering. "They are doing exactly what I knew they would do," Yamamoto said. "They are turning their entire nation into a war machine. Every factory, every shipyard, every resource is being directed toward one goal, our destruction. And we cannot match them. It is not a question of courage or skill. It is mathematics. Watanabe asked if there was any path to victory. Yamamoto's response was chilling. We would have to destroy their will to continue. We would have to inflict such costs, such casualties, that the American people would demand peace. But I do not think this is possible. I have lived among them. I understand them. They will not quit. They will fight until we are completely defeated, no matter how long it takes. This was the terrible knowledge that tormented Yamamoto in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. He understood, with absolute clarity, that Japan had embarked on a war it could not win. The attack he had planned and executed had not altered this fundamental reality. If anything, it had made Japan's position worse by unifying American opinion and providing moral justification for total war. The contrast between Yamamoto's understanding and the prevailing mood in Japan was stark. The Japanese press trumpeted the Pearl Harbor attack as the greatest naval victory in history. Newsreels showed cheering crowds, triumphant military parades, celebrations of Japanese superiority. The public was told that America had been dealt a knockout blow, that the soft, materialistic Americans would soon beg for peace. Yamamoto knew this was fantasy. He read the intelligence reports from America. He saw the photographs of recruitment lines stretching around city blocks. He received updates on American industrial mobilization. He understood what was coming. In his cabin aboard Nagato, late at night when the celebrating had finally died down, Yamamoto would sit alone with his thoughts. His personal steward, who survived the war and was interviewed decades later, described finding the Admiral at his desk at 3 a.m., surrounded by reports and charts. He was not sleeping, the steward recalled. He was calculating, always calculating, how much time we had, how many ships we could build, how many the Americans could build. I do not think the numbers ever brought him comfort. There was one report that particularly troubled Yamamoto. American intelligence, intercepted and decoded, revealed that President Roosevelt had called for the production of 60,000 aircraft in 1942 alone, and 125,000 in 1943. These numbers seemed impossible. Japan's entire aircraft production capacity for 1942 was projected at 5,000 planes. Yamamoto showed the intercept to Captain Kuroshima, his chief operations officer. Do you think these numbers are real? Or is this propaganda to frighten us? Kuroshima studied the document. Sir, American industrial capacity is substantial, but these numbers seem exaggerated. 60,000 aircraft in 1 year? It cannot be done. Yamamoto shook his head. I have seen their automobile factories. I have seen their assembly lines. If they are reporting these numbers, they believe they can achieve them. And if they believe it, we must assume they will. He was right to be concerned. By the end of 1942, America produced 48,000 aircraft. By the end of 1943, 86,000. The numbers, if anything, proved to be conservative estimates. American industrial capacity, once fully mobilized, exceeded even what American planners had thought possible. But there was something else troubling Yamamoto, something perhaps more fundamental than industrial statistics or strategic calculations. It was the moral dimension of what Japan had done. Yamamoto had opposed war with America precisely because he believed Japan would lose. But he had also opposed it because he respected America, admired much about American society, and did not want to see the two nations destroy each other. Now, Japan had launched a surprise attack that killed thousands of Americans. America would respond with overwhelming force. Young Japanese men, boys, really, many of them barely 20 years old, would die in vast numbers, fighting a war they could not win. Japanese cities would burn. Japanese civilians would starve. All of this was foreseeable. All of this was, in Yamamoto's view, avoidable. And yet, despite his misgivings, despite his understanding of what was to come, Yamamoto remained a loyal Japanese officer. He would plan operations, command fleets, and do everything in his power to give Japan the best chance possible. But he would do so without illusions, without the intoxicating optimism that gripped most of his colleagues. In January of 1942, Yamamoto received a letter from a friend asking him to assess Japan's chances. His response, captured in the letter that survives in Japanese naval archives, was brutally honest. Britain and America may have underestimated Japan somewhat, but from their point of view, it's like having one's hand bitten rather badly by a dog one was feeding. It seems that America, in particular, is determined before long to embark on full-scale operations against Japan. He was describing precisely what Roosevelt had called for in his speech to Congress: not a limited war, not a negotiated settlement, but full-scale operations until Japan's unconditional surrender. The very concept was alien to Japanese military thinking. Wars were supposed to end with negotiated settlements after decisive battles, but America was preparing for something different. Total war, fought with total commitment, until the enemy was completely defeated. The first sign that Yamamoto's fears were justified came in April of 1942. On April 18th, 16 American B-25 bombers, launched from the carrier Hornet, struck Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The Doolittle raid, as it became known, did minimal physical damage, but the psychological impact was profound. Japan, the invincible conqueror of Asia, had been struck in its homeland. The emperor himself had been put at risk. The military leadership, which had promised the Japanese people they were safe, had been humiliated. The attack accomplished exactly what its planners intended. It demonstrated American resolve and damaged Japanese morale. For Yamamoto, the Doolittle raid was confirmation of what he had been saying all along: America would fight back. America would take the war to Japan's doorstep. The only question was how quickly American power would build. On June 4th, American dive bombers struck 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, in the span of 5 minutes. All 3 were left burning and would sink. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, was destroyed later that day. Japan lost 4 of the 6 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, along with hundreds of irreplaceable aircrew. The Battle of Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. Everything Yamamoto had predicted came true. Japan had run wild for 6 months. After that, as he had warned, the situation changed dramatically. America's industrial power began to manifest. New carriers appeared. New aircraft filled the skies. American submarines, operating from the Pearl Harbor base that should have been destroyed, began systematically hunting Japanese merchant shipping. Yamamoto survived Midway but understood its implications. Japan had lost the strategic initiative. From this point forward, Japan would be reacting to American moves, not dictating the pace of operations. The window for Japanese offensive operations had closed permanently. In the months after Midway, Yamamoto's earlier predictions continued to materialize with terrible accuracy. American shipyards began launching new Essex-class carriers at an impossible pace. American factories delivered thousands of new aircraft monthly. American forces seized Guadalcanal, establishing a foothold in the Solomon Islands. Each intelligence report confirmed what Yamamoto had known since December 8, 1941. Japan was fighting a war of attrition against an enemy with 10 times its industrial capacity. The mathematics were inexorable. Every Japanese ship sunk could not be replaced. Every American ship sunk was replaced by 3 more. By early 1943, the disparity was becoming obvious even to officers who had dismissed Yamamoto's warnings. Japanese pilots, the elite aviators who had struck Pearl Harbor, were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Training programs could not keep pace with losses. Meanwhile, American pilots arrived at the front with hundreds of hours of training, flying aircraft superior to anything Japan could produce. Yamamoto received reports from frontline commanders describing the changing nature of the air war. In 1942, Japanese Zero fighters had dominated aerial combat. By mid-1943, American Hellcat fighters were achieving kill ratios of 19-1. The advantage had shifted completely. But Yamamoto would not live to see Japan's final defeat. On April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid, American codebreakers decrypted a message detailing Yamamoto's inspection tour of the Solomon Islands. The message included his exact schedule, flight path, and aircraft type. Admiral Nimitz faced a decision. They could ambush and kill Japan's most capable naval commander, but doing so would reveal that American intelligence had broken Japanese codes. After consultation with Washington, the decision was made. The strategic value of eliminating Yamamoto outweighed the risk of compromising code-breaking operations. On the morning of April 18th, 18 P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted Yamamoto's transport aircraft over Bougainville. In a brief, violent engagement, both Japanese aircraft were shot down. Yamamoto's plane crashed in the jungle. He was found still strapped in his seat, killed instantly by machine gun fire. The man who had warned Japan not to attack America, who had planned Pearl Harbor while predicting it would lead to defeat, who had understood from the beginning that Japan could not win a prolonged war, was dead. He never lived to see the firebombing of Tokyo, the atomic bombs, or Japan's surrender. Perhaps that was a mercy. But in his cabin, after his death, officers found his personal papers. Among them were letters, diary entries, and strategic assessments that painted a picture of a man who understood exactly what Japan had done on December 7, 1941. They had won a tactical victory and guaranteed a strategic defeat. One document, a letter to a fellow admiral written in February of 1943, summarized Yamamoto's view. "We succeeded in our surprise attack, but we failed in our objective. We aimed to cripple American naval power for 2 years, long enough to secure our conquests and force a negotiated peace. Instead, we unified our enemy, provided them with moral justification for total war, and left intact the facilities that allowed them to recover in 6 months. We won the battle and lost the war." This assessment, found decades later in Japanese naval archives, represents Yamamoto's final judgment on Pearl Harbor. It was not the dramatic sleeping giant quote of cinema, but it was far more damning. It was a professional military officer's sober analysis of a strategic blunder, because that is what Pearl Harbor ultimately was, a brilliant tactical operation that achieved all its immediate objectives while failing completely in its strategic goals. The attack was supposed to buy Japan time. It bought 6 months. It was supposed to break American will. It unified American resolve. It was supposed to cripple American naval capability. It left American carriers untouched and American support infrastructure intact. The tragedy is that he was right about everything. Japan did run wild for 6 months. The Battle of Midway did occur exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. American industrial mobilization did exceed even pessimistic Japanese estimates. America did fight a total war until Japan's unconditional surrender. Every prediction Yamamoto made came true. And yet Japan fought on for 3.5 years after Yamamoto's death. They fought, knowing they could not win, sacrificing millions of lives for a cause that had been lost at the moment of Pearl Harbor's success. This was the ultimate irony. The attack that was supposed to secure Japan's position in Asia instead guaranteed Japan's destruction. The officers who celebrated in Nagato's wardroom on December 8, 1941, could not see this. They saw burning American battleships and assumed victory. Only Yamamoto, sitting alone in apparent depression, understood what they had actually accomplished. They had started a war they could not win against an enemy that would not quit by attacking in a way that unified that enemy's resolve. In the decades after the war, as historians sifted through Japanese archives and interviewed surviving officers, Yamamoto's story emerged as one of the great tragedies of World War II. Here was a man who understood the strategic situation perfectly, who warned repeatedly against war with America, who was ignored by political and military leaders convinced of their own superiority. And when war became inevitable, he planned and executed the attack that made everything worse. Pearl Harbor, intended to secure Japan's position, instead guaranteed Japan's defeat by awakening American power and resolve. The tactical success of December 7th led directly to the strategic catastrophe of August 1945. The real story of Yamamoto after Pearl Harbor is not about a dramatic quote that may never have been spoken. It is about a brilliant strategist forced to execute a plan he knew was futile, watching his predictions come true one by one, knowing that every Japanese victory was merely postponing an inevitable defeat. When his staff celebrated on December 8th, Yamamoto sat in depression because he could see the future clearly. In 6 months, Midway. In a year. Guadalcanal. In 2 years, American forces island hopping across the Pacific. In 3 years, the Philippines. In 4 years, Okinawa. And finally, the firebombing of Japanese cities and atomic weapons that would force surrender. All of this was foreseeable on December 8, 1941, not in specific detail, but in general outline. Yamamoto saw it because he understood America in a way his colleagues did not. He had lived there. He had studied there. He knew that America, once committed to war, would fight with overwhelming force until victory was complete. The lesson of Yamamoto's story transcends World War II. It speaks to the danger of confusing tactical success with strategic wisdom. Pearl Harbor was tactically brilliant, a masterpiece of planning, execution, and surprise. But it was strategically disastrous, transforming American opinion overnight and providing moral justification for total war. Modern military professionals study Pearl Harbor not as an example of how to conduct a surprise attack, but as an example of how tactical success can mask strategic failure. You can sink 8 battleships and still lose the war. You can achieve complete surprise and still guarantee your own defeat. You can win the battle decisively and still awaken a force that will ultimately destroy you. This was Yamamoto's burden after December 7th. He knew all of this. He had predicted all of this. And now he had to watch it unfold, exactly as he had foreseen, knowing that nothing could change the outcome. The celebrations in Tokyo, the triumphant newsreels, the proclamations of Japanese invincibility, all of it must have seemed hollow to Yamamoto. He was living in a different reality than his celebrating countrymen. They saw victory. He saw the beginning of the end. And in the quiet of his cabin aboard Nagato, as his officers toasted their great victory, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood that Japan had just made the greatest strategic blunder of the war. Not because the attack failed, it succeeded brilliantly, but because it succeeded in all the wrong ways, accomplishing tactical objectives while guaranteeing strategic defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. At 10 minutes past midnight, on June 6, 1944, Lieutenant Norman Poole crouched in the belly of a Halifax bomber, 6,000 feet above Normandy. He wasn't leading an elite strike force. He wasn't jumping to seize a bridge or destroy a radar station. He was about to do something far stranger. He was about to jump alongside 400 burlap scarecrows. That sounds absurd. It sounds like the setup to a dark joke, but those scarecrows, each one stuffed with straw and rigged with explosives, were about to fool an entire German army. They were about to draw 2 panzer divisions away from the real invasion, and Norman Poole, along with 11 other men from the 2nd Special Air Service, was going to sell the deception by playing gramophone records in the dark French countryside. This was Operation Titanic, and if it failed, if the Germans saw through the trick, the men landing on the beaches at dawn would face reinforced divisions that could slaughter them in the surf. The fate of D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history, rested partly on the shoulders of 12 commandos and 400 fake paratroopers made from farm sacks. The Allied High Command knew a terrible truth. Even with surprise, even with overwhelming naval and air support, the Normandy landings were fragile. Intelligence estimated that German commanders could move 7 panzer divisions to the beaches within 48 hours. If those divisions arrived before the Allies established a secure beachhead, the invasion would collapse. Thousands of men would die. The war could be extended by years. So the Allies built a plan, not just one plan, but dozens, all designed to confuse, to misdirect, to make the Germans believe the invasion was coming somewhere else. Operation Bodyguard, Operation Fortitude. These were elaborate deceptions involving fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks in southeast England, and double agents feeding false intelligence to Berlin. But on the night of the invasion itself, when 18,000 real paratroopers would drop into Normandy, something immediate was needed, something visceral. They needed the Germans to believe paratroopers were landing everywhere. In places they weren't, far from the beaches, far from the real drop zones. and they needed the Germans to respond, to send troops chasing ghosts while the real invasion force established itself. This is where the scarecrows came in. The British called them Ruperts. The Americans called them Oscars. Officially, they were device, camouflage, number 15. But to the men who would jump with them, they were just burlap dolls, 3 feet tall, hollow heads and limbs made from Hessian sacks, filled with straw and sand to give them weight. Each one cost about £3 to manufacture. They looked ridiculous up close, a child's toy, crudely sewn. But the physics were sound. From the ground, at night, against a dark sky with no reference point for scale, a 3-foot object, descending under a parachute, looked exactly like a 6-foot man. The human eye couldn't tell the difference. And that was all that mattered. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Each Rupert was equipped with 2 devices. The first was a pintail, a noisemaker that simulated rifle fire when the dummy hit the ground. A spring-loaded mechanism would create sharp cracking sounds for 30 minutes, mimicking a firefight. The second was a small explosive charge, timed to detonate 20 minutes after landing. The explosion served 2 purposes. It destroyed the evidence of the dummy itself, and it simulated a paratrooper burning his own parachute, standard operating procedure for airborne troops to deny the enemy valuable silk. But Ruperts alone weren't enough. The Germans weren't fools. They had fought airborne troops before. In Holland, in Crete, they knew what a real parachute assault looked like. It involved gunfire, yes, but also shouting, commands, the sounds of men regrouping, of officers barking orders, of equipment being assembled. If the Germans found only silent dummies with noisemakers, they would quickly realize the deception. So the planners decided to add human operators, real soldiers who would jump with the Ruperts and sell the illusion. Volunteers from the Special Air Service, men trained in sabotage and deep reconnaissance, would parachute into enemy territory carrying portable gramophone players. These weren't ordinary gramophones. British engineers had recorded 30 minutes of authentic battlefield sounds, men shouting in English, sergeants yelling orders, the distinct metallic clang of mortar tubes being dropped, machine gun fire. The recordings were then pressed onto special discs and housed in portable players powered by hand-cranked mechanisms. The SAS teams would land, hide the gramophones in hedgerows and ditches, play the recordings on loop, and then engage any German patrols they encountered, not to destroy them, but to wound them, to allow survivors to escape, to let them run back to their commanders and report that British paratroopers had landed in force. The entire operation was psychological warfare distilled to its most primal form. Make them see, make them hear, make them believe. Lieutenant Norman Poole was 26 years old. He had joined the 2nd SAS in 1943, recruited for his language skills. Poole spoke fluent German. His father had been a diplomat, and Norman had spent 2 years in Berlin as a teenager. This made him invaluable for interrogations and for bluffing his way through enemy checkpoints. But more than that, Poole had a talent for improvisation, for thinking on his feet, for talking his way out of impossible situations. His commanding officer in the 2nd SAS, Lieutenant Colonel Brian Franks, initially refused to participate in Operation Titanic. Franks called it a waste of highly trained men. He had read the intelligence briefing. The mission required volunteers to jump behind enemy lines, unarmed except for pistols, carrying gramophone players and fireworks. The life expectancy for the teams, according to the planners, was measured in hours. Franks told the operation coordinators to find someone else. But M.R.D. Foote, the intelligence officer coordinating the mission, persisted. He needed SAS men. They were the only soldiers with the training to survive alone behind enemy lines. They knew how to move undetected, how to navigate by stars, how to blend into terrain. After 3 days of negotiations, Franks relented. He would provide 12 men, but they had to be volunteers. No man would be ordered into this mission. Poole volunteered immediately. So did Captain Frederick James Fowles, known to everyone as Chick. So did troopers Dawson, Saunders, Hurst, and Merriweather. 12 men in total. They would form 2 teams of 6. One team would jump near Saint-Lô, the other near Yvetot. Both locations were far from the real landing zones. Both were positions where German commanders would expect airborne assaults if a major invasion was underway. The briefing took place on June 3rd, 3 days before the invasion. The 12 men gathered in a Nissen hut at an airfield near Stratford-upon-Avon. An intelligence officer spread maps across a wooden table and explained the plan with clinical precision. 400 Ruperts would be dropped in 4 separate zones. Titanic 1 would simulate a full airborne division landing north of the Seine River, near Yvetot. 200 dummies. 1 SAS team. Titanic 2 was cancelled due to air traffic concerns. Titanic 3 would drop 50 dummies southwest of Kern. Titanic 4 would drop 200 dummies near Marigny, again simulating an airborne division. Another SAS team. The officer pointed to the maps. Red circles marked the drop zones. Blue arrows showed predicted German troop movements. If the operation succeeded, German reserves would move toward the dummy landings, away from the beaches, away from the real paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne, away from the British 6th Airborne. The mathematics were brutal. 40 RAF aircraft would carry out the drops. 4 squadrons, number 138, number 161, number 90, and number 149. They would fly low, under radar coverage, and release the dummies from 1,500 feet. The SAS teams would jump from the same altitude. Once on the ground, the teams had 3 objectives: play the gramophone recordings, engage German patrols, allow survivors to escape and report the landings, and then? The officer didn't sugarcoat it. Survive as long as possible, evade capture, make contact with the French resistance. If the teams could survive 48 hours, the invasion would be secure. If they could survive a week, they might be able to extract themselves. But the mission was classified as near suicidal. No one expected all 12 men to come home. Poole asked one question. What if the Germans capture the gramophones? What if they realize the recordings are fake? The intelligence officer smiled grimly. Then you improvise, Lieutenant. You're SAS. That's what you do. On the night of June 5th, the weather over Normandy was marginal. Low clouds, strong winds. The invasion had already been delayed 24 hours due to storms in the Channel. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower had made the agonizing decision to proceed despite the conditions. The weather forecast predicted a brief window of improvement. If they didn't go now, the tides wouldn't be right again for weeks. Poole and his team loaded into a Halifax bomber at 1900 hours. The aircraft was stripped down, every unnecessary piece of equipment removed to maximize payload. The bomb bay doors had been removed and replaced with a jump platform. Wooden benches lined the fuselage. The team wore standard British airborne smocks, but without unit insignia. If captured, they could claim to be regular infantry. It wouldn't save them. German policy toward commandos was explicit: immediate execution. But it might buy them time. Each man carried a Webley revolver, 2 spare magazines, a compass, maps printed on silk, emergency rations for 3 days, and 1 gramophone player packed in a padded canvas bag. The gramophones weighed 14 pounds. They were unwieldy. They made stealth difficult. But they were the heart of the mission. The Halifax took off at 2100 hours. The flight to Normandy would take 90 minutes. The aircraft flew at wave-top level to avoid German radar installations at Cherbourg and Le Havre. Poole sat near the rear of the fuselage, watching the English coast disappear into darkness. The roar of the twin engines made conversation impossible. The other 5 men in his stick sat in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. At 22:30, the crew chief appeared and shouted, "Over the engine noise." 30 minutes. Poole checked his gear for the 4th time. Pistol loaded, compass secured, maps folded in the inner pocket of his smock, gramophone strapped to his back. The parachute harness was tight, almost painfully so, but it had to be. A loose harness could break ribs on opening shock. The Halifax began to climb. They needed altitude for the drop, 1,500 feet. low enough to avoid detection, high enough to give the parachutes time to deploy. The aircraft shuddered as it entered a cloud bank. Rain hammered the fuselage. Poole felt his stomach tighten. This was real now. In minutes, he would be standing in the door, then falling, then alone in enemy territory. The crew chief appeared again. 10 minutes. Red light. The team stood and hooked their static lines to the overhead cable. The static line would deploy the parachute automatically when they jumped. No time for hesitation. No time for second thoughts. When the green light came on, you jumped. That was the rule. Poole was third in the stick. Fowles was first. Trooper Dawson second. Then Poole. Then Saunders, Hurst, and Merriweather. They shuffled toward the jump door. The wind screamed through the open hatch, cold, violent. Poole could see nothing below except darkness. The crew chief held up 5 fingers. 5 minutes. Fowles stood in the door, hands gripping the frame, body leaning forward into the slipstream. Poole watched him. Fowles was 31. A veteran of North Africa. He had jumped into combat 4 times. He was calm, focused. That helped. The red light turned green. Fowles disappeared. Just gone. Swallowed by the night. Dawson followed. 1 second later. Then it was Poole's turn. He stepped to the door. The wind tore at his face. He didn't think. Thinking was dangerous. He jumped. The sensation was instant and overwhelming. The slipstream grabbed him and tumbled him sideways. The static line pulled tight. The parachute deployed with a violent jerk that knocked the wind from his lungs. Then silence. Just the whistle of wind through the suspension lines. He looked up. The canopy was fully inflated. No twists, no tears. He was alive. Below him, he could see the dark mass of the French countryside. Fields, hedgerows, a ribbon of river reflecting starlight, and then, scattered across the landscape, dozens of white parachutes. The Ruperts. They were already falling. Hundreds of them. It looked real. God help him, it looked real. Poole landed in a wheat field. The impact drove him to his knees. He rolled, collapsed the parachute, and lay still for 30 seconds, listening. Silence. No gunfire. No shouts. He had landed in an empty field. He was alone. He stood, gathered his parachute, and stuffed it into the hedgerow. Then he moved north, toward the sound of distant rifle fire. The pintails. The Ruperts were doing their job. He found Fowles 200 yards away, crouched in a drainage ditch. Then Dawson. Then the others. All 6 had landed, within a quarter mile of each other. Luck. Pure luck. Fowles gave the signal. They moved inland, away from the drop zone, toward a small copse of trees marked on their maps. By 01:30, they had set up the first gramophone. Fowles placed it in a hedgerow facing a dirt road. He wound the crank, lowered the needle onto the disc, and the recording began. Shouts in English. Orders. The clank of metal. It was eerie. Convincing. Even knowing it was fake, Poole felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. At 0 to 200, exactly as predicted, German radio operators began reporting parachute landings. The intercepts were immediate. Airborne troops east of Caen. Airborne troops near Saint-Lô. Airborne troops near Yvetot. Multiple locations. Large numbers. The reports went up the chain of command. Regimental commanders. Division commanders. Army Group B headquarters. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in the west, ordered the 12th SS Panzer, Division Hitler-Jugend, to investigate a reported airborne landing near Lisieux. The Panzer Division moved. Tanks, half-tracks, artillery, an entire division, 10,000 men, moving away from the beaches. Chasing Ruperts. The 915th Grenadier Regiment of the 352nd Infantry Division, positioned near Omaha Beach, received orders to send a battalion to investigate parachute landings south of their position. The battalion moved, 800 men, moving away from the beach, away from where the Americans would land in 5 hours. Operation Titanic was working, but for Norman Poole, crouched in a French hedgerow at 02:30 on the morning of June 6, 1944, The night was just beginning, and it would be a very long night indeed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By 0 to 300 hours, Poole and his team had moved the gramophones 3 times. The tactic was simple. Play a recording for 30 minutes in one location, then move half a mile and play it again. Create the impression of troops on the move. Troops regrouping. The more ground they covered, the larger the phantom force appeared. But movement was dangerous. The French countryside was not empty. German patrols were everywhere. Poole's team had already spotted 2 Wehrmacht squads moving along the roads. Both times, the SAS men had let them pass. No contact yet. The mission required restraint. Engage only when necessary. Make every encounter count. At 0 to 400, everything changed. Trooper Saunders, acting as point man, froze and raised his fist. The signal for enemy contact. The team dropped into a ditch. Poole crawled forward. 50 yards ahead, illuminated by moonlight, a German patrol was investigating something in a field. They had found a Rupert. Poole watched through the darkness. 6 German soldiers, maybe 7. They were gathered around the dummy, examining it. One of them held up the burlap form, shouting to his comrades. Even from 50 yards away, Poole could read the confusion on their faces. This wasn't a paratrooper. It was a doll, a scarecrow. The Germans knew. Fowles whispered the order. Engage. The plan had always accounted for this possibility. If Germans discovered the dummies, the SAS teams had to create doubt, make them question what they'd found, make them wonder if the doll was just one defective unit among hundreds of real paratroopers. Poole and Dawson moved left, flanking the patrol. Hurst and Merriweather moved right. Fowles and Saunders stayed centre, classic L-shaped ambush. When everyone was in position, Fowles fired first. The sound was sharp and sudden in the quiet night. His Webley barked once. One of the Germans went down, clutching his leg. The others scattered, diving for cover. But they didn't know where the shots were coming from. In the darkness, muzzle flashes came from 3 directions at once. Poole fired twice. Deliberate misses. He aimed high, over their heads. The goal wasn't to kill. It was to terrify, make them panic, make them run. And run they did. 2 Germans helped their wounded comrade to his feet. They retreated, firing blindly into the darkness as they went. Within 90 seconds, they were gone, crashing through the hedgerows toward the road. Perfect. They would report contact with British paratroopers. Armed, organised, dangerous. They would report that the scarecrow they'd found was just one anomaly. The real threat was still out there. But Fowles knew the clock was now ticking faster. That firefight would bring more patrols, more searches. The team needed to move. They collected the gramophones and headed southwest, deeper into the bocage, the dense hedgerow country that made Normandy such nightmarish terrain. For the next 6 hours, as dawn broke over the beaches and the greatest invasion in history began, Poole's team played cat and mouse with German patrols. They set up gramophones in abandoned barns. They fired from hedgerows and then disappeared. They cut telephone lines and sabotaged road signs. Small acts of chaos, each one designed to reinforce the illusion of a large-scale airborne operation. By 0 to 600, the beaches were ablaze. 25 miles to the north, men of the 4th Infantry Division were wading ashore at Utah Beach. Men of the 1st Infantry Division were dying in the surf at Omaha, and the German 915th Grenadier Regiment, the unit that should have been reinforcing Omaha's defences, was still 6 miles inland, searching for British paratroopers that didn't exist. Operation Titanic had succeeded. But success meant survival, and survival was about to become far more difficult. At 0 to 900 on June 6th, General Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff for German 7th Army, reviewed the overnight reports, parachute landings east of Caen. Most of them turned out to be dummies. Parachute landings near Saint-Lô, also dummies. The pattern was obvious. The Allies were using decoys. Speidel issued a new order: decrease alert level. The dummy paratroopers were a diversion. The real threat was on the beaches. All mobile reserves were to move toward the coast. The deception, for all its initial success, was unraveling. The Germans were adapting, but they couldn't ignore one troubling fact. Some of the parachute reports involved actual contact, gunfire, casualties, which meant at least some of the paratroopers were real. Small teams, perhaps, commandos, saboteurs, and those teams needed to be hunted down. The German 3rd Parachute Division, a veteran unit that had fought in Russia, was pulled from reserve and deployed to the bocage around Saint-Lô. Their mission was to sweep the countryside, find the Allied commandos, eliminate them. Norman Poole didn't know this yet, but by June 8th, he would discover that his hunters were no longer regular Wehrmacht infantry. They were Fallschirmjäger, German paratroopers, elite troops, men who understood the terrain, men who understood how commandos thought. For 40 days, Poole's team survived behind enemy lines. 40 days. That number is staggering when you understand what it meant. They had rations for 3 days. After that, they relied on the French resistance, farmers who risked execution to hide them, villagers who shared their bread, resistance fighters who moved them from safe house to safe house, always one step ahead of German patrols. They lived in barns, in root cellars, in the crawl spaces beneath floorboards. They moved only at night. They communicated with hand signals. They learned to sleep in 2-hour shifts. One man always awake, always watching. Poole's German language skills became invaluable. Twice, they talked their way past checkpoints, Poole posing as a Wehrmacht sergeant, escorting prisoners. On June 15th, the resistance brought them intelligence. 3 American paratroopers from the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment were hiding in a barn 10 miles away. They had been captured during the initial invasion, held in a German truck, and had escaped when Allied aircraft strafed the convoy. One of them was wounded badly, a bullet through the thigh. He couldn't walk. Fowles made the decision immediately. They would extract the Americans. 3 SAS men, Poole, Merriweather, and Hurst, volunteered for the mission. They walked through the night, guided by a French teenager who knew every hedgerow and farm track in the region. It took 6 hours. When they found the Americans, Poole saw the severity of the situation. The wounded man, a private named Jenkins, was in bad shape. Infection had set in. His leg was swollen and hot to the touch. He needed a surgeon. He needed antibiotics. Neither was available. But he couldn't stay. German patrols had been seen in the area. The barn wasn't safe. Merriweather, a man built like a bull, simply picked Jenkins up and carried him. All 10 miles back, through the dark, over stone walls, across ditches. Jenkins weighed 170 pounds. Merriweather carried him for 6 hours without complaint. By dawn on June 16th, all 3 Americans were safe with the resistance. One of them was Captain Berry, a medical officer. He treated Jenkins as best he could with the limited supplies available, but Jenkins needed evacuation. Fowles made the decision. They would attempt to reach Allied lines. The front had moved. The beachhead was expanding. British and American forces were pushing inland. Intelligence from the resistance suggested that Allied units were now within 8 miles. They could make it. It would be dangerous, crossing active battlefields, but it was possible. On the night of July 15th, 40 days after the initial jump, the team began their move toward Allied lines. 6 SAS men, 3 American paratroopers, 1 wounded man being carried on a makeshift stretcher. They moved slowly, too slowly. At 0 to 200 on July 16th, near the village of Sainte-Mère-Église, they encountered 2 German paratroopers on patrol. It happened fast. The Germans came around a hedgerow, walking directly toward them. There was no time to hide, no time to divert. Poole raised his pistol. The Germans raised theirs. Then the grenades came. The first grenade landed between Fowles and Hurst. The explosion was deafening. Fowles went down, shrapnel in his back. Hurst took fragments in both legs. The second grenade landed near Merriweather. He was hit in the back and shoulder. 2 of the Americans were also wounded. The uninjured men dragged their comrades into a nearby farmhouse, a small stone building with thick walls. They barricaded the door. Fowles, despite his wounds, tried to organize a defense. But within minutes, they heard the sound they had dreaded for 40 days. Vehicles, many vehicles, and voices, German voices, shouting orders. They were surrounded. Poole looked through a crack in the shutters. 40 German paratroopers. At least 40. They had moved up quickly, reinforcing the two-man patrol. The farmhouse was encircled. There was no escape. Fowles tried to stand but collapsed. His back was bleeding badly. Hurst couldn't move his legs. Merriweather was conscious but fading. Captain Berry, the American medical officer, was doing what he could, but he had no supplies, no bandages, no morphine. The Germans called out in English, "Surrender! You are surrounded. Surrender now." Poole looked at Fowles. The captain nodded. There was no choice. They had fought for 40 days. They had completed their mission. Operation Titanic had succeeded. D-Day had succeeded. The beachhead was secure. The invasion was irreversible. But this, right here, was the end of the line. Poole walked to the door and opened it. He raised his hands. In German, he called out, "We surrender. We have wounded. We need medical assistance." The German paratroopers moved in, weapons raised. They searched the farmhouse, disarmed the British and Americans, and separated them. Fowles was carried out on a stretcher. The Germans, professional soldiers, immediately began treating the wounded, field dressings, morphine injections. Whatever the policy was about executing commandos, these Fallschirmjäger were not going to let men bleed out. But Poole knew what came next. Interrogation. He was taken to a tent behind German lines. An SS Untersturmführer, a junior officer in black uniform, sat behind a field desk. He spoke perfect English. He had Poole's identity discs in front of him. The discs identified him as a lieutenant in the British Army, but they didn't say SAS. The interrogator asked the first question. What unit? If he admitted he was SAS, he would be executed. Hitler's commando order of 1942 was explicit. All commandos, all special forces, all irregular troops captured behind enemy lines were to be shot immediately. No trial, no prisoner of war status. But Poole also knew that his German was flawless, and the interrogator was young, maybe 24, educated, probably from a good family, not a fanatic, just a soldier doing his job. Poole looked at him and lied with absolute conviction. 6th Airborne Division, he said. We were dropped on D-Day. Our transport was hit. We scattered. We've been evading ever since. The interrogator studied him. Your uniform has no insignia. Lost in the jump, Poole replied. The parachute harness ripped the patches off. The interrogator switched to German. Let's continue in German, Lieutenant. I know you speak it. Poole didn't hesitate. He responded in German, matching the interrogator's educated accent perfectly. Of course, my mother was Austrian. This was Poole's gamble. By speaking fluent German, by treating the interrogator as an equal, he was humanizing himself, making it harder to execute him, making it easier to believe the lie. The interrogation continued for 2 hours. The interrogator asked about the 6th Airborne's operations. Poole gave vague answers, truthful where he could be. He described the chaos of the initial drop, the scattered landings, the confusion. All of it was true for the real paratroopers. None of it mentioned gramophone players or scarecrows. Finally, the interrogator closed his notebook. You will be transported to a prisoner of war camp, you and your men. Poole felt the tension drain from his body. Prisoner of war camp, not a firing squad. The lie had worked, but the interrogator wasn't finished. He leaned forward. I know you're not telling me everything, Lieutenant. I know that much. But you fought well. You survived 40 days behind our lines, and you tried to save your wounded. That says something. So I'm going to accept your story. But if I find out later that you lied, that you're commando, I will make sure you are found. Do you understand? Poole nodded. I understand. He was taken back to the others. Fowles, Hurst, and Merriweather were being loaded onto a truck bound for a field hospital. The 3 Americans were with them. Poole climbed aboard. The truck pulled away from the farmhouse, heading east, deeper into German-held territory. For 2 days, they were held at a field hospital. Fowles and the others received surgery. The German doctors were skilled and professional. They removed shrapnel. They stitched wounds. They administered antibiotics. Whatever hatred existed between the armies, the medical staff treated them as patients, not enemies. On July 18th, they were loaded onto a train. Destination: a prisoner of war camp in Germany. The train was a converted freight car, packed with wounded Allied prisoners, British, American, Canadian. The conditions were grim. No food, no water, straw on the floor, the smell of infection and unwashed bodies. But they were alive. The train journey took 3 days. On July 20th, as the train passed through France near the city of Reims, Allied aircraft appeared. P-51 Mustangs. They were hunting German supply trains. And they couldn't tell that this train carried prisoners. The first strafing run killed 12 men in Poole's car. The 50 caliber rounds punched through the wooden walls like paper. Men screamed, blood sprayed. Poole threw himself flat on the floor, covering his head with his arms. The train stopped. German guards jumped off and waved white flags. The Mustangs circled back, saw the flags, and broke off the attack. But the damage was done. 12 dead, 20 wounded. Poole and Fowles had survived, barely. On July 21st, the train reached its destination, Stalag the 7A, near Moosburg, Germany. A massive prisoner of war camp holding 70,000 Allied prisoners. Poole was separated from Fowles and the others. Officers went to one compound, enlisted men to another. He would spend the next 10 months in Stalag Thife, 10 months of boredom, hunger, cold, and uncertainty. But he was alive. And that was more than 11 of the 12 men who had jumped on Operation Titanic could say. Of the 12 SAS soldiers who participated in the mission, only 3 survived the war. Poole was one of them. Fowles was another. One other trooper, whose name was never fully declassified, made it to Allied lines in August. The other 8 were either killed in action or executed by the SS at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in violation of the Geneva Convention. Poole was liberated on April 29, 1945, when American troops overran Stalag the 7th. He weighed 130 pounds. He had lost 40 pounds during his captivity, but he walked out on his own feet, carrying nothing but a small notebook in which he had documented everything. Every day. Every interrogation. Every lie he had told. After the war, Poole returned to England. He was awarded the Military Cross for his actions on Operation Titanic. The citation was brief and vague, mentioning only exceptional courage and leadership during operations in occupied France. It didn't mention scarecrows. It didn't mention gramophone players. The operation remained classified until 1996. Poole never spoke publicly about the mission. He returned to civilian life, working as a translator at the Foreign Office. He married. He had 3 children. When historians tracked him down in the 1980s, trying to piece together the story of Operation Titanic, he gave a single interview. It lasted 20 minutes. He described the jump, the gramophones, the capture. And then he ended the interview with a single sentence. "We did what needed doing. Nothing more." Norman Poole died in 2007 at the age of 89. His obituary in the Times mentioned his wartime service in a single paragraph. It didn't mention that he had helped fool an entire German army with burlap scarecrows. It didn't mention that his lie to an SS interrogator saved 6 men from execution. It didn't mention that he had walked 10 miles through enemy territory carrying wounded Americans on his back. But the historians knew. The military researchers knew. And most importantly, the families of the men who landed on Omaha Beach knew, because the 915th Grenadier Regiment, the German unit that should have reinforced Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, didn't arrive until June 7th. They spent crucial hours on D-Day searching for phantom paratroopers near St. Lo, searching for men who weren't there, chasing shadows and scarecrows. Military historians estimate that Operation Titanic diverted between 10,000 and 15,000 German troops away from the landing zones during the critical first 12 hours of the invasion. The 12th SS Panzer Division alone wasted 6 hours investigating dummy parachute drops. 6 hours. In that time, American forces secured Utah Beach, British forces secured Gold and Sword, Canadian forces secured Juno. The cost? 12 SAS soldiers, 8 killed, 3 captured, 1 escaped, 400 burlap dolls, 2 short, Sterling bombers and their crews. The benefit? The invasion of Europe succeeded. The Second World War in Europe would end 11 months later. Operation Titanic is largely forgotten today. It doesn't have the recognition of Overlord or Market Garden, but it worked. It worked because 12 men were willing to jump into darkness, carrying gramophone players. It worked because Norman Poole was willing to lie to save his men. And it worked because sometimes, in war, the most effective weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet, it's a scarecrow. The lesson is older than recorded history. Deception has always been part of warfare. The Trojan horse, Sun Tzu's art of war. But Operation Titanic refined it to a science. It understood that human perception is flawed, that fear magnifies threats, that confusion paralyzes decision-making, and that sometimes the appearance of force is more valuable than force itself. Modern military deception operations owe their existence to missions like Titanic. The ghost army that deceived German forces throughout the European campaign, the elaborate fake invasion preparations at Pas de Calais that convinced Hitler the Normandy landings were a feint. Even today, military doctrine includes deception as a core component of planning, but technology has made it harder. Satellite reconnaissance can distinguish real tanks from inflatable ones. Thermal imaging can spot the difference between humans and dummies. Electronic warfare can detect fake radio transmissions. The scarecrows of 1944 wouldn't work in 2025, yet the principle remains. Make your enemy believe what isn't true. Make them commit resources to threats that don't exist. Make them question their own intelligence. In an age of information warfare, of deepfakes and social media manipulation, Operation Titanic's lessons are more relevant than ever. Norman Poole understood something profound. That survival isn't just about fighting. It's about thinking. It's about convincing your enemy that you're something you're not. It's about having the courage to jump into darkness with nothing but a gramophone and a prayer. 12 men, 40 days, 400 scarecrows, and the invasion of Europe succeeded. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.